That's me in the corner. That's me in the spotlight, losing my religion. That's right, time to do my origin stories. I think every atheist has to do that sooner or later if they started in a Christian community. And it's about time for me to do mine. So, let's talk about how I became atheist T girl. Well, you can guess the T part, trans, but the atheist part, that is something that is surprising to me because I grew up in a very Christian household. You know, you'll hear this a lot, but it was true for me. I went to church all my life, and starting around the age 8, my family started a church in Fort Walton Beach. They didn't start the church, but we started going to a church. And it was called Ocean City Baptist. And these were a bit on the right wing fundamentalist side. And we went there for over 10 years. I won't quite say it's a cult, but at times it felt like it. And my dad became a school teacher there. So not only did I go to church 3 times a week, Sunday morning, Sunday evening, and Wednesday evening, I went to school there 5 days a week. It was a one-room schoolhouse of grades second through whatever grade I was in, because I was the oldest student there. I was the first one to graduate. Trying to keep my dirty clothes out of the screen and try to make it so my arm doesn't get all tired. Let's try that. No, that doesn't look good. That looks terrible too. I was the first one to graduate. That feels better. I went to this church. I grew up knowing that it was my duty and my destiny to become a preacher. Yes, at some point, I was going to be a preacher. And I felt that's what God was calling me to do. But I also had trouble because deep down, I didn't believe it. Not that being a preacher. I figured I could still be a preacher even if I didn't believe it. Because you can. I've known people who've done it. Well, I don't know, but I've read of people who've done it. And so I thought maybe I could still do it. But I had trouble believing it. And I think the best way, the church was very charismatic. They were so charismatic, they got kicked out of the Baptist convention and started their own denomination. Yeah, way off track there. And they believed in laying of hands to speak in tongues, falling out in the Spirit. If you don't know what falling out in the Spirit is, well, first of all, speaking in tongues. There's a belief in the Bible that God's going to teach you, or when God sends the Holy Spirit onto you, that you will speak in a language not known by humans. But God knows what it is, and sometimes people will be able to translate for you. And so we would do this praying, and people would start speaking in tongues. And depending on how loud they spoke, it was either supposed to be a private prayer to God or one that was supposed to be interpreted. And that was always weird because, every once in a while someone was be in the middle of church and go, and everyone would get quiet, and we'd wait for a little bit, and then someone usually would stand up and go, "So saith the Lord, my hand will be upon you, and you shall not stray from my word. You will be blessed all of your days." And it would go on like that for a couple of minutes. And then there was the people where you're supposed to be praying and you're just talking, and apparently what you needed was so important and so big that you couldn't say it in your own words, so the Spirit would talk for you. Yeah, I made up my own spirit language because I couldn't get one from everyone else. I didn't get one. I prayed and prayed and prayed, but I never got one. The second half of that was laying on hands and being slain in the Spirit. There is a belief that when the Holy Spirit is really strong in you, sometimes they will just touch you on your head and you'll fall backwards, hit the ground. And I tried and tried. I fell once, but I knew it was me the whole time doing it because I never could get the Spirit strong enough in me. And I wondered what was wrong, what I was doing wrong. I read the Bible, I prayed. I tried my best to believe, but I still had all these doubts and I couldn't get it to work for me. Years later, I read a book by F. Paul Wilson, I believe is the name. And at one point, he's describing this cult that these people are part of. Well, the leader of the cult, he knows it's a fake. He knows everything is fake. He's just doing it for money. And what he would do is gather his apostles and his inner circle, and he'd talk about, oh, so last night I was full of the Spirit or whatever their cult was about, and I went walking through the sky. And he would make up all these full of bullshit stories about how powerful he was and how great his mind was for what he was doing. Well, sooner or later, people in his inner circle started making up their own stories. And he described the mind of one of the people who was doing it. And this one person felt like he was the only one in the whole group who wasn't getting it. And so he started making up his own stories so that everyone else would not think that he was not a real follower, and never knowing that everyone else in the group is doing the same. And the only person who knows that it's all fake is the person who created it. And he's doing it to make more money, so he's not going to speak out. And that's what my church felt like. Well, anyway, after about 10 years, I got engaged and had to move to Southwest Florida. And that was a help, because I got away from the church and I got away from my family. I still went to a church. It was a Vineyard Church in Cape Coral, and it had its own problems. They're a bit of homophobic, and yeah, they weren't the best church, but I tried. I even started going to seminary there. Yeah. That stopped when I happened to confess that I sometimes looked at porn. How could I be such a terrible Christian? Oh, it was so scandalous, and I got kicked out of the, I was starting to work in a youth group. I got kicked out of that, and I got kicked out of being in a seminary. I wasn't kicked out, but I was strongly encouraged. So, I eventually ended up getting divorced, and my ex and I were both going to a church together. It was not quite a Christian, but not quite a pagan church, and I was still struggling trying to find out what God wanted for me. And at this point, I still wasn't believing. I kept hoping there was something. I would pray and pray and pray, and nothing ever came out of it. So I remember one day I was reading a book, and it turned out it was a fiction book, but part of it was made out true. And it was talking about how in the book of the 3 Gospels that have the story of the doubting Thomas. And if you're not familiar with the Bible, there's a part of the Bible where Jesus is resurrected, and one of his disciples is a bit of a shit and says, I ain't going to believe Jesus is back until I can talk to him and see him and touch his wounds. And when Jesus shows up, and they were there, and he touches the wounds, he said, okay, Jesus, I believe you. Well, from what I was reading in this book, that story wasn't included in all the books when they were written at first. Instead, it was added during the Council of Nicaea, and it was added in order to make the disciple Thomas look worse. And they wanted him to look worse because one of the books at the time that was interesting or was being considered was the Book of Thomas, except it conflicted with the other books of the Bible and was more Gnostic's approach to Jesus. And so they added this to make it look like Thomas was a doubter, so his book would not be used. And there's other parts they added to the Bible. Well, I had always believed that if God wanted us to know what was going on and he was in control of everything, then sooner or later the books would be right, even if they were, even if there was issues. God would make sure that the right stuff got into his Bible and his word would get there. And I believed his hand would be on it and we'd end up with the right books. But what I could not see was people having to lie for God, having to add books and words to make his words make sense. And that didn't make sense. And as soon as I realized that, I realized I couldn't believe in him anymore. And I stopped believing in him. And that was the end of it. And it took me years to finally, first I went from a believer to agnostic because I just couldn't picture there not being an afterlife. And eventually I became atheist. And there was other stuff along the way, but I have a kid walking in the door, so I will do more another time, but I promised I would do a live video tonight, and here it is. Again, that's the story of me coming out, not coming out, but finally believing I was atheist and getting rid of the church I've been part of.